All right, we are back in Blender once more, and we are going to create the fire animation now, which is it's a bit more complex than the walking and the idle, but it's not too hard, and it's pretty fun to make. So yeah, let's just get started. So first, we want to, as usual, we want to make a new animation. So let's go back. With the gun selected, let's go and choose the idle pose. And let's duplicate this idle pose here by pressing the new action key. And let's call this one gun fire. Like this. Oh, small f, sorry. And make sure you save it. And so for the fire animation, there's a few ways to make this. I mean, it's very, there's a lot of freedom when making this. You can kind of make your own interpretation of how a gun should fire, or you could make it a bit more realistic and look at like real life references, stuff like that. But since this is a kind of like a stylized low poly, I think we can go with kind of like a cartoony kind of stylized look here. It doesn't have to be all too realistic. So what I usually do is that on the first frame, so on frame 1, I usually bring the gun forward, and then on frame 2 I bring it back, so it kind of, when you play it, it looks a bit more powerful because it kind of goes forward first, but it's only on one frame, so it's really fast. It goes forward and then boom, it goes back. And then I usually add some rotation here, so it goes like this when you're shooting. And then of course we have to animate the slider as well. And if you want to be even more detailed, we can also animate the finger. So we can make it look like the finger is actually shooting by rotating it like this. Yeah. So let's start by selecting the gun bone here, the gun root bone, and make sure we are on frame 1. And let's go ahead and move the gun a bit forward like this. So just slightly forward on frame 1. And then we can go to around frame 3 and bring it back again. And we should bring it further back than the original pose, so there's kind of like some force being kind of pushing it back, like the recoil. And something like this. Can bring it down a bit too. And then we can actually duplicate the original keyframes here. So for the default idle pose, by selecting the top one, we can select all of them. And we can actually move them back to around frame 10. So currently what we have is the gun goes forward and then goes back, and then it goes back to the idle. And these are just like the very basic keyframes we have placed out here, and obviously we're going to need some polish to make it look good. So let's go ahead and do that. First we can select the gun here, and I usually start working right away in the graph editor. You could also work a bit more here with the keys and just place out keys like the main poses, but I usually prefer to kind of jump straight into the graph and start messing around here. So as we can see, this is the graph for the Y movement. So this is the forward motion, and we can start modifying these a bit. And so the bigger the curves, so if we make this curve bigger, it's going to stay here for longer, and if we make it smaller like this, it's just going to bounce back straight ahead. So it's going to be like a bouncing ball kind of motion. So you can just play around with this and see what looks best. I mean, the main thing about animation is just that I feel like personally is just messing around with the curves and kind of seeing what looks best, you know, and just finding that look that feels and looks good. Let's go ahead and duplicate this and place it out here. And also, one of the things that make animations really feel a bit more fluid and a bit more dynamic is when we offset keys. So instead of having all the keys end at the same keyframe here, we could actually offset them a bit. So for example, the forward keys would end a bit later, and we can make the rotations a bit more offset, you know, so they don't like always arrive here at the same key, because then it looks very stiff when it just kind of completely stops here, right? So basically what I'm doing now is I'm adding some extra motion here to the y-axis, so it actually goes a bit forward before going back to the idle pose. And if you want, you can add some more, even more bounciness to it. And this is all, you know, personal preference. You can mess around with this as much as you want, and yeah, make it look just as you want it, of course. All right, and let's mess with with the Z axis as well, so the up and down motion. Let's see, it moves up, and then we want to move down a bit. And move it up a bit at the end. And I usually like to kind of add some bounciness to the end, so it doesn't just come to a full stop right away. It kind of like has some extra motion before it fully stops. And that looks a bit too shaky. All right, and let's go ahead and animate the slide, so we can actually see what it's going to look like when the slide is going back. So let's expand the slide bone here, and let's start by duplicating the keyframes so it's not open by default. And let's go ahead and let's go around frame 2 and just select the slide bone here and move it back all the way. And I think that's a bit too soon, so let's move it a bit. And we can actually, it actually plays the keyframe for the rotations here as well, and the scale. We don't really need that, so we can just go ahead and delete these by clicking on them and pressing X. Because we really only need the location keys, so we don't need the rotation and scale. And I usually make the slide stay open for like 1 or 2 frames, just so you can see it. Because sometimes when you're playing it in-game, if it's only open for like 1 frame, it's very fast, and it's like really hard to see it. So I usually make it stay open for like 1 or 2 frames, just so you kind of have some time to see it being opened. And right, so what I did now is I made it open here on frame 3, and it stays open on frame 4, and on frame 5 it goes back. So I just copied the default pose here and placed it on frame 5. And let's try and make it stay open a bit more. So we could even do 3 keys, I think. Because right now it's open 1, 2, 3. And then it closes. So yeah, usually 2 or 3 frames is usually good for the slide. Let's go with 3. All right, and I think it's lacking some rotation here. So when you come back here, I feel like the gun should rotate on the x-axis. So it should kind of go like this, you know, because of the recoil, it's gonna push it back a bit. So let's go ahead and add that. Let's go to the X rotation curve in the graph editor. And let's start messing with these a bit. Oh. And it can kind of rotate down as well initially, so like this, and then so it kind of slightly rotates down first, and then when the slide is fully back, it rotates back like that. And let's make it a bit sooner actually, so like this. And as always, you can always just mess around with these and get that look that you personally prefer. And let's add another keyframe here by pressing Control and left clicking on the curve. And let's go ahead and move it down here. So when the slide kind of snaps back here on frame 5, we want the gun to also rotate forward, because I usually think of it as like the force. There's like some force being applied from the slide when it snaps back. So the force should also slightly rotate the gun, because the force being added kind of pushes the gun down like this, like, you know? And that's a bit too much actually. Yeah, it could be a bit less. Yeah, the fire animation, you have to kind of, there's a lot of repeating here, just watching the same animation over and over. So I do recommend taking breaks if you're working on multiple fire animations. It can get a bit tiring, so I do recommend taking breaks and coming back to it, because sometimes when you animate for a very long time, like all animations eventually start looking bad because you've seen them like for many hours. So it's always good to take a break. Right, I think that's starting to look better. Let's also add some rotation shake here. And I do feel like the gun should move forward a bit more here. So on the y-axis, it should kind of move forward a bit with when the gun rotates down. So let's go ahead and fix that. Maybe not that much. Let's go ahead and mess with the z-axis a bit, make it move a bit more down, I think. Oh, not the whole one, just this one. Oh, if you want to select multiple ones, you can either shift right click like this, or you can press B to use the box selection, which is pretty useful if you want to select multiple ones like this. Very useful. Alright, and I think that looks a bit better. So basically what I just did is I offset the Z location a bit. So if we look here at the keyframes, we can see that the Z keys are actually slightly extending outside of the default pose here. So it should return to the default pose here, but it actually returns to the default Z pose here. So it's a bit delayed, I suppose you could say. So we can see that it's kind of still moving here after the actual return to the pose. Which makes it feel a bit more natural, I suppose. Let's try and move it up a bit. And let's just mess with the rotation a bit here. And you can kind of keep messing with these until you feel like it feels like a natural motion, you know, not too stiff, not too robotic, because that's usually what animations feel like if all keys are on the same keyframe. So they usually feel a bit stiff. So I usually just mess around with this until I get that nice kind of natural motion. It's starting to look pretty decent. Let's move it back slightly. All right, I think this is starting to look pretty good. We can also add some Y rotation, so on this axis like this. And what I usually do is when the gun reaches this pose here, I usually kind of rotate it a bit like this or like this, just to add some nice details to it. So let's go ahead and select the Y quaternion curve and select this one. Let's just move it a bit. And maybe upwards actually, so it rotates to the right. And you can just mess around with these, see what looks best. And like I've said before, I think the trick to making it look really fluid and smooth is to actually have the keys kind of spread out like this, so they're not all sort of on the same frame here. which is usually what I do. I mean, they don't have to be at different frames at all times, but sometimes they kind of have to be on the same frames when they're, you know, but for the most part they could be slightly spread out. All right, I think that's starting to look pretty good. And don't forget to save, by the way. You should always save, very important. And let's go ahead and add some Z rotation as well. So some nice sort of side-to-side rotation as well. And let's just select the keyframes here and rotate it like this. That's a bit too much. And let's insert a new keyframe here by pressing Control and left clicking. Yeah, you don't want too much of this. It might look a bit weird if we add too much Z rotation. Could also try inverting it like this. I do think that looks pretty good, and we also get the nice little extra rotation here at the end, so it kind of adds to the whole thing. When you're shooting and it kind of does like a little shake. I think that looks pretty nice. And let's go ahead and maybe a bit more, move it up a bit here. Just mess with the up and down a bit. All right, I think that's starting to look good. Right, I think that's starting to look pretty good. One more thing I do want to add is some a slight rotation to the finger here, so it actually looks like the finger is pressing the trigger. So to do that, let's go back to the arm rig by going back to object mode first, selecting the arm rig, and then choosing post mode. And we actually have to create a new animation for the arms as well, since they're separate rigs, so we need two animations. And so let's go ahead and select the FP idle pose and duplicate it. And let's call this one FP fire. So it's going to be the same name as the fire for the gun, but for the arms instead. And let's choose the bone here. So the finger bone. And let's start by duplicating this key here, so we have the base pose for it. So let's just place it around frame 2 like this. And let's go to the frame where we actually want the finger to be pushed down. And I think around frame 3 would be good. So let's select the finger and press RX to rotate it. And let's just rotate it to the pose that we want. And obviously the trigger, we haven't added a bone for the trigger. We could have done that to add some more detail, but usually you don't really see the trigger in games, and especially not here. We can actually see it, so it doesn't make sense to animate it. But we could do that if we want some more detail, I suppose. But I think this works for now. Right. And I usually keep the finger pushed down for like 1 or 2 frames. Otherwise, it's just like the slide. It just happens too fast. You can't really see it. So let's go ahead and duplicate this, the trigger finger pose. And let's also duplicate the default finger pose and place it on like frame 8. So basically what happens now is that the finger stays until frame 2, and then it goes to the push down rotation, and it stays like that for 2 frames, and then it slowly transitions back over 4 frames. So if we play that now, okay, so we can actually see that it looks pretty good. The finger is pushing down on the trigger. We could probably make it a bit faster, slightly. Right, so the problem with making it faster is that it's really hard to tell, because it just happens too fast, so you can't really tell what's going on. So I usually keep it for a few frames pushed down, just like this. All right. And now we can go back to the gun rig. So go back to object mode, select the gun, and pose mode. And actually, let's go back. Let's go back to the arm rig for a second. What we can do now is we can actually animate the camera. So we can add some, a little bit of shake to it when we're shooting. And sometimes in games, this camera shake is applied using code in the actual game. But it could also be nice. You have a bit more control over it here, so you can actually make it look the way you want. So I think we're going to go ahead and animate it in Blender. So right, so go to the arm rig in pose mode and select the camera. And let's just expand it here in the action editor. And so what we want to rotate the camera on is the x-axis. And it's important to, when you're animating the camera, you don't want too much movement, because that could kind of make you feel motion sick if you're watching this in like a full screen, kind of like this, and the camera just starts shaking like crazy. You don't really want that. So the key is to have some slight movement, just like this, like very small movements. They're still noticeable, but they're not going to make you sick, which is good, and they're not going to make the player sick. So that's the goal here. So let's go ahead and duplicate the X key here, the X rotation, and let's just place out 3 of them, and go to the graph and focus on the X rotation. And let's find the spot where we want the camera to shake. So usually around here, when the pistol kind of does this, when it rotates back, that's usually where I would put the shake. So let's move it so that the center key here is on the shake. And let's move it by pressing GY. Okay, that's a bit too much. And let's also scale it down so it's a bit snappier. So with the key selected, press S and scale it down. And let's just move these a bit closer, something like that. Right, and that's usually the kind of speed I would go for the rotation. Just like a quick shake, it's very quick. It happens over like a few frames, but it's still noticeable. Actually, it's a bit too much still, I think. Let's make it a bit smaller. yeah, something like this. You know, just a quick little shake. It really adds to the animation overall, but it's a very simple thing to do. But I think it does add a lot to it. So at frame 3, it's still normal, and then on frame 4, rotates down, and then kind of slower, there's a slower transition back to the default rotation. Let's also add an extra key here at the end and add a little bit of overshooting here, so it kind of rotates back down a bit before going to the default. So now there's just like a bit more shake and a bit more, if we see, as we can see here, it kind of wiggles a bit. There's a little bit of a wiggle at the end, which looks pretty cool. And let's actually move them back one frame. So usually you would time this shake with the muzzle flash, usually. So you can kind of imagine when the muzzle flash would appear, and try to time the shake with that. So yeah, something like that. I think that's pretty good. You, as always, feel free to test this yourself and modify it and mess around with that. But yeah, I do think that looks pretty nice. And I am pretty happy with the gun movement. I do think it's a bit too much, maybe. You know what? I think it looks fine. I think it looks really good, actually. So yeah, I think I'm gonna call it done now. Obviously, there's a few more things I could have added. Could have added some, maybe some arm movement. We could have added some more finger movement as well. Yeah, feel free to go ahead and add some more detail to it, make it a bit more polished, and yeah, mess around with the curves as well. See what it would look like if you move them around a bit. Yeah, and if this went a bit too fast for you, feel free to rewatch this or check out the source files. All the source files are available in the folder, so you can go ahead and check those out. But yeah, I think I'm gonna call it done here for the fire animation. I'm gonna go ahead and save it. And yeah, that's it for this lecture. Hope you found it useful. And I will see you in the next lecture, where we will be creating the reload animation. All right, bye-bye.